During the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union sought to gain dominance over the other by various ways such as espionage, economic domination, technological advancements, but the most common way was proxy wars. A proxy war is an armed conflict between two nations, each supported by third parties. In this case, we have South Vietnam supported by the USA and North Vietnam supported by China and the Soviet Union. As we know, the Vietnam War ended up as the USA's most shameful defeat, and it is still talked about to this day, even though it ended 50 years ago. So what does the US need to do to win the war? First, we need to find out why the US lost the war in the first place. There are three big reasons why the US Army failed in Vietnam. 1. The Vietnamese people didn't trust the Americans because of the atrocities they committed on the civilian population. 2. The American people hated the war. Why did families need to send their sons halfway across the globe to die? 3. There were no strategic objectives. The Americans' troops wouldn't dare to cross into the north because of possible Chinese retaliation. So they were just stuck in South Vietnam, bombing everything they could. Starting with the first point, the Americans committed war crimes. From the My Lai massacre, where hundreds of innocent Vietnamese civilians were beaten, killed, and other crimes. Bombing of Vietnamese villages. Hundreds of thousands of innocents died. So is it really a surprise that the citizens started to side with the communists? So, to make the population more open to American influence and troops, let's say that America goes out of its way to protect the citizens, create propaganda on how they will liberate the Vietnamese from the puppet regime in the north, and provide care packages for villages to help them survive during these hard times. At the same time, no more indiscriminate bombing and rough discipline is instilled into the troops to not mess with the native population. On to the second point, the American population at home didn't understand the war or what was its purpose exactly. The reason why the US sent troops into Vietnam was to stop the so-called domino effect, where in theory, after Vietnam fell to communist influence, countries in the region would keep falling to this ideology, while now we know that this wouldn't happen, as only Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia became communist countries. At the time, there was certainly a fear that eventually all of Asia would fall to communism. Instead of keeping the population in the dark about the war, create valid justifications such as protecting and liberating the citizens of Vietnam. The North Vietnamese also committed horrid war crimes, and if the Americans takes the role of protecting the Vietnamese civilians, these war crimes should be justification enough to end the North Vietnamese government. With this being the first televised war, showing people at home the atrocities committed by the North Vietnamese would certainly spark support for helping the South. And lastly, the Americans in our timeline didn't cross into the North because they were afraid of a repeat of the Korean War. So instead, they tried to defend the South while excessively bombing North Vietnam. Now, as we know, this clearly didn't work. The bombing wasn't only very ineffective, but also very costly for the American army. So instead, let's say that the US command decides that an offensive into North Vietnam is the best course of action. The USA officially declares war on North Vietnam and sends hundreds of thousands of troops into the country. What happens next? With Americans nearing Hanoi, China officially enters the war on the side of North Vietnam. What happens next is most likely a repeat of the Korean War, with the country being split down the middle at the end of the war, with North Vietnam becoming a Chinese puppet state and South Vietnam becoming a state reliant on US support for its existence. As a small side effect, Cambodia doesn't fall to the Khmer Rouge, but instead remains a dictatorship under the martial Lon Nol. At the same time, instead of Americans outsourcing their industry to China, they would first do it in Vietnam. This results in a weaker China and a stronger American presence in East Asia. South Vietnam would be richer than the North due to American investments and them outsourcing their industry here. But it wouldn't be such a drastic difference as today's North and South Korea. North Vietnam would still be prosperous, just not as much as the South. Since the war is won, the famous Top Gun program, which revolutionized the US air training quality, never becomes a thing. And as a fun fact, since the Top Gun program won't exist, neither will Top Gun, Maverick, the movie with Tom Cruise. Fun facts aside, This war would teach the US that they can and should intervene in all possible communist uprisings around the globe, as this helps them prevent the spread of communism. This could have devastating consequences, especially when Cuba would fall to the communists. Why? Because the Soviets would give nuclear bombs to the Cuban government, and the US would be quick to invade them, which might lead to a nuclear war and the end of all humanity. Thank you for watching this video, and see you all in the next one.